Good day and welcome to Scriptures Unlocked. Today's video will be looking at what language did Jesus speak. It promises to be a very educational and informative presentation. There has been some confusion as to the language Jesus spoke while he was on earth and lived in Nazareth, a city in the northern district of Galilee, and now the largest Arab settlement in the nation of Israel. Therefore, this presentation, as I stated before, will be looking at the question, what language did Jesus speak? The general consensus, my friends, among religious scholars and historians is that Jesus and his disciples primarily spoke Aramaic, which they contend was a prevalent language in first century Judea. Most scholars believe and come to this conclusion because Jesus grew up and spent most of his time in and around Nazareth and Capernaum, which they claim were Aramaic-speaking villages. Many scholars have even suggested that Aramaic was the most commonly used language among the ordinary Jewish folk, as opposed to the Hebrew language, which was reserved for the priests, scribes, Pharisees, and Sadducees, who they considered to be the religious elites. Therefore, it is widely believed and accepted that Jesus and his disciples used Aramaic in their daily lives as a means of communication. We will examine whether this predominant view is true or false from a scriptural perspective. It is absolutely clear from the scriptures that Jesus was at least bilingual. That is, he spoke at least two languages, Hebrew and Aramaic. However, what we need to ascertain is which one of these two was his primary language. We will search the scriptures and the scriptures alone to find the answer to this question: what was Jesus's primary language? Before we look at the scriptural evidence for the answer, let's look at this interesting exchange between Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Pope Francis on this very same topic. This dialogue took place on May 26, 2014. So here is the video between Pope Francis and the Israeli Prime Minister.
Relazione tra cristianesimo e ebraismo, che attingono dalla stessa fonte. Gesù ha vissuto qui. Parlava ebraico. Parlava aramaico ma conosceva l'ebraico perché conosceva gli scritti.
Okay, so that's the very interesting dialogue between Pope Francis and the Israeli Prime Minister on what language Jesus spoke. So in the video, we saw where the Israeli Prime Minister said that Jesus lived in Israel and he spoke Hebrew. The Pope corrected and said Aramaic. And then the Israeli Prime Minister acquiesced to the Pope and said he spoke Aramaic, but knew Hebrew. So we'll be examining who is correct and which language did Jesus speak primarily. So the following day, after that interesting exchange, the Washington Post published an article on the light-hearted exchange between both gentlemen. Let's read about it as well. So the Washington Post article, the following day, is captioned, "What language did Jesus speak? The Pope and Israel's Prime Minister disagree." It was written on May 27, 2014 by Ishan Tharoor. And this is the article. Pope Francis carried out a headline-grabbing 3-day tour of the Holy Land, visiting refugees, hugging clerics, and honoring the victims of the Holocaust. But perhaps the most interesting moment of the trip came during an exchange with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at a meeting in Jerusalem. The Israeli Premier and the Pope found occasion for a slight historical quibble. And I quote, "Jesus was here in this land. He spoke Hebrew," end of quote. Netanyahu told the Pope through an interpreter. Aramaic, the pontiff immediately corrected. "He spoke Aramaic, but he knew Hebrew," offered Netanyahu. The article goes on to say you can watch the full exchange below, which is the video I played earlier. And the article goes on to say that reaction on social media was swift, with many siding with the Pope's correction. Reza Aslan, author of a recent best-selling popular History of Jesus chimed in. And this is what he tweeted. And no, Jesus didn't speak Hebrew. He may have understood it, but it wasn't primary spoken language. He spoke Aramaic. So he was saying that Jesus spoke Aramaic. The article goes on to say, neither Netanyahu nor the Pope was wrong, but the question is a matter of emphasis. There is scholarly consensus that historical Jesus principally spoke Aramaic, the ancient Semitic language, which was the everyday tongue in the lands of the Levant and Mesopotamia. Hebrew was more the preserve of clerics and religious scholars, a written language for holy scriptures. Even so, certain portions of the Old Testament are written in Aramaic, a sign of its prevalence in Jewish antiquity. And they put a parenthetical statement, there remain those particularly devout Christians who dispute Aramaic's primacy at that time. And I am one such person. Let's go back to my study notes. So the article was saying that Jesus spoke Aramaic. So let's continue. Below is a screenshot of the first result from a Google search I conducted on the question, what language did Jesus speak? And there were 127 million results. And this result came back in 0.60 seconds. And the answer is Aramaic. He goes on to say, Hebrew was the language of scholars and the scriptures, but Jesus' everyday spoken language would have been Aramaic. And it is Aramaic that most biblical scholars say he spoke in the Bible. We will decipher what is the true language that Jesus spoke while he was on earth. As the Washington Post article stated, the question is a matter of emphasis. So we need to decipher whether this quote unquote scholarly consensus is correct, that Jesus principally spoke Aramaic and knew Hebrew, or if Jesus principally or primarily spoke Hebrew, but also knew Aramaic. Further proof of this widely held belief can be found in the article below. I'll also share this article where the gist of the author's point is that Jesus spoke Greek. So this is the article. It was written by Don Stewart. And the question is, what language or languages did Jesus speak? He goes on to say, the language that the children of Israel spoke in the days of the Old Testament was Hebrew. However, in 586 BC, they went into Babylonian captivity, where Aramaic was main spoken language. Aramaic, a sister language to Hebrew, began to be spoken by the Jews from the Babylonian captivity onward. So he's saying that Aramaic was a spoken language after Babylonian captivity onward. When Jesus came into the world, the Greek language was spoken in all parts of the Roman Empire. There were, however, both local and regional dialects in the land. It seems the Jewish people in Israel, Jesus' day, continued to speak Aramaic. And then there's a subtitle, Greek was the international language. Greek became the international language through the conquest of Alexander the Great, 330 BC. We know that Jesus was able to speak Greek because several of his conversations could have only taken place in the Greek language. And this is speculation on his part. He goes on to say, this includes the account of his speaking to the woman with the demon-possessed child, as well as his conversations with Pontius Pilate. Another subtitle, Aramaic was also spoken. Jesus also spoke Aramaic in his public ministry. We have several recorded sayings of Jesus in the Gospels that are transliterated from Aramaic to Greek. These include the words he uttered at the raising of Jairus' daughter. And he quotes Mark 5:41. And he took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Here, Mark translates the Aramaic phrase for his readers. Other Aramaic words found in the New Testament are Abba and Ephata. That's correct. The other subtitle that he uses is Hebrew may have been spoken. There is a possibility, so he's casting doubt, that Jesus spoke in Hebrew at times. Some people argue that Hebrew was actually the main language that Jesus spoke, but this is a minority view. This is the view that I subscribe to, that Jesus spoke Hebrew primarily. Another subtitle, Latin was spoken only by the elite. Although Latin was the official language of the Roman Empire, it was not spoken by the masses. Only the aristocracy would converse in Latin. The sign over the cross was in 3 languages. The sign over the cross of Jesus illustrates the fact of the many languages spoken at that time. And then he gives a summary. The world in which Jesus came had an international language, Greek. Jesus obviously spoke Greek. There are certain occasions that the New Testament records for us where Jesus would have had to have spoken Greek to the Syrophoenician woman as well as to Pontius Pilate. On occasions, he probably spoke Aramaic. It is possible that he spoke Hebrew on occasions. We know that he could read Hebrew, and that's the end of the article. So his gist is that Jesus spoke Greek. He probably spoke Aramaic, and he knew that he certainly could read Hebrew, but he's not sure if Jesus spoke Hebrew. We will be looking at the scriptural evidence to see which language Jesus spoke. So let's continue with our study. The truth is, there are a number of languages that were spoken during the time of Jesus in the 1st century AD, and these include Aramaic, Greek, Hebrew, and Latin. I will now proceed to give a background on each of these languages before allowing the scriptures to provide the answer as to what language Jesus spoke primarily. I'll be looking at Aramaic firstly. Aramaic is a language that was spoken by the Arameans, who were the descendants of Aram. The scripture tells us in Genesis 10 that unto Shem also, the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth the elder, even to him were children born. And this verse tells us that Japheth was the oldest son of Noah, not Shem, as most people believe. The verse says that the brother of Japheth the elder, the brother of Shem, Japheth was the elder brother. Verse 22 says that the children of Shem, Elam, who were the Persians, and Ashur, who became the Assyrians, Arphaxad, who became the Babylonians, Lud were the Lydians, and Aram became the Syrians. Therefore, my friends, Aram was the 5th son of Shem, and the Aramaic language was derived from his name. Aram, which is Strong's H758, means exalted and can refer to Mesopotamia, the nation of Syria, or Syrian or Aramean people. Let's go to the Blue Letter Bible to look at Genesis chapter 10, verse 21. Genesis chapter 10, verse 21. Actually, verse 22. Let's look at the Strong's number for H758. Aram, this is the pronunciation.
Strong's H758, Aram, Aram, and the form just below that, Aram, Aram.
Okay, and it occurs 132 times in the Hebrew scriptures. It is translated Syria 67 times, Syrians 56 times, Aram 7 times, Syria Damascus 1 time, and Syria Mahaka 1 time. Outline of biblical usage. It is a proper masculine noun. It means Aram or Arameans, and it means exalted. Aram or Syria the nation, the Syrian or Aramean people. And it says that Aram was the 5th son of Shem, a grandson of Nahor, a descendant of Asher. Strong's definition. Aram, the island, Aram or Syria and its inhabitants, also the name of the son of Shem, a grandson of Nahor and of an Israelite, Aram, Mesopotamia, Syria, Syrians. And these are the verses in which Aram appears below. Aram, Strong H758, matches the Hebrew Aram, which occurs 132 times in 117 verses in the Hebrew Concordance of the King James Version. So Aram is the name of the man from which Aramaic was derived. So from early biblical history, Aramaic was a language that was spoken by those dwelling in Mesopotamia or Aram, like Laban, Jacob's uncle. And you can see Genesis 31, verse 47, and Deuteronomy 26, verse 5. Aramaic was also spoken by the Assyrian and the Babylonian empires, as well as the Persians, who conquered the Babylonians. There are scriptural references to support the assertion and show that Aramaic was also spoken by these three great empires. Let's consult again the original Hebrew as we look at the following verses: 2 Kings 18, verse 26-28, Ezra 4, verse 7, Isaiah 36, verse 11 to 13, and Daniel 2, verse 4. These verses use the following words or phrases: the Syrian language, the Jews' language, the Syrian tongue, as well as Syria. Let's now look at 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 26. 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 26. This is a very fascinating verse. It says here, "Then said Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, and Shebna and Joah unto Rabshakeh, Speak, I pray thee, to thy servants in the Syrian tongue or Syrian language, for we understand it, and talk not with us in the Jews' language in the ears of the people that are on the wall." So what was happening here is that Rabshakeh was sent by the king of Assyria to speak to King Hezekiah, king of Judah. But Hezekiah sent these three men to speak to Rabshakeh. And they were saying to him, "Speak to us in the Syrian language, for we understand it, but don't speak to us in the Jews' language." What is fascinating about this verse is that it makes a clear distinction between the Syrian language, which is Aramaic, and the Jews' language, which is Hebrew. Let's look at the Strong's number for both of these languages to see that the Syrian language refers to Aramaic and the Jews' language refers to Hebrew. Syrian language is Strong's H 762. Let's look at that. This is the Hebrew script. It is pronounced this way.
Strong's H 762. Aramaic. Aramaic.
Aramaic. It occurs 5 times in the entire Hebrew scriptures. It is translated Syrian language twice, Syrian tongue twice, and Syriac 1 time. This is the outline of biblical usage. Aramaic, that's the language of Aram or Aramaic. Strong's definition is Aramaic in Aramean, in the Syrian language or tongue, in Syriac. And it occurs 5 times in 4 verses. These are the verses. 2 Kings 18, verse 26, which we read earlier. Ezra 4, verse 7, and it says, "In the days of Artaxerxes wrote Bishlam, Mithridath, Tabeel, and the rest of their companions unto Artaxerxes, king of Persia. And the writing of the letter was written in the Syrian tongue or Aramaic and interpreted in the Syrian tongue." Isaiah 36, verse 11 is also a repeat of 2 Kings 18. This is what it says. "Then said Eliakim and Shebna and Joah unto Rabshakeh, Speak, I pray thee, unto thy servants in the Syrian language or in Aramaic, for we understand it, and speak not unto us in the Jews' language in the ears of the people that are on the wall." And Aramaic or Aramaic appears the final time in the Hebrew scriptures in Daniel 2, verse 4, when the Chaldeans were speaking to Nebuchadnezzar. And this is what they said. "Then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac or in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell thy servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation." Let's go back to 2 Kings 18, verse 26, and look at the other word that is translated the Jews' language, which is Strong's H 3066. This is the Hebrew script, and it is pronounced Yehudith.
Strong's H 3066. Yehudith. Yehudith.
Yehudith. And it occurs 6 times in the entire Hebrew scriptures. And it is translated the Jews' language 5 times and the Jews' speech 1 time. Outline of biblical usage in the Jewish language in Hebrew. So the Jews' language is Hebrew. Strong's definition, Yehudith, the Jewish language in the Jews' language. And it occurs 6 times in 6 verses. And these are the verses. 2 Kings 18, verse 26, which we read. It's also used in 2 Kings 18, verse 28. And what happened here is that Rabshakeh defied the 3 men's request or denied their request. Then Rabshakeh stood and cried with a loud voice in the Jews' language, or in Hebrew, and spake, saying, hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. Remember in verse 26, they were saying, speak to us in the Syrian language, for we understand it, and talk not with us in the Jews' language. But he defied them and spoke in the Hebrew language, so that all the people could hear. 2 Chronicles 32 verse 18 says, then they cried with a loud voice in the Jews' speech unto the people of Jerusalem that were on the wall, to affright them and to trouble them, that they might take the city. This is a similar account to what was done, what was read in 2 Kings. Nehemiah 13 verse 24. Let me go to this verse so we can get the context. So this was actually after the Babylonian captivity and the Jews came back to the land of Israel. They had married strange wives. So this caption, mixed marriage is forbidden. Verse 23 of Nehemiah 13 says, in those days also saw I Jews that had married wives of Ashdod, of Ammon, and of Moab. And notice what happened as a result of the intermarriage. And their children spake half in the speech of Ashdod. And Ashdod was one of the five cities of the Philistines. And their children spake half in the speech of Ashdod, and could not speak in the Jews' language. So their children could not speak Hebrew, but they spoke according to the language of each people. So let's go back to the other instances in which the Jews' language is mentioned. Isaiah 36 verse 11 and Isaiah 36 verse 13, which is also a repeat of what transpired in 2 Kings chapter 18. It says here, and you can see it on the screen, that the three men said to Rabshakeh, speak to thy servant in the Syrian language, for we understand it, and speak not to us in the Jews' language in the ears of the people that are on the wall. So it is clear that Aramaic and Hebrew are two distinct and separate languages that were spoken at that time. So let's go back to the study notes. So 2 Kings 18 verse 26 and Isaiah 36 verse 11 to 13 are very important and vital in establishing the biblical fact that though Aramaic Strong's H 762 and Hebrew Strong's H 3066 are from the same linguistic family, they are two separate and distinct languages. The other point that must be noted from the verses is that Eliakim, Shebna, and Joah could speak in both Aramaic and Hebrew, since by their own admission, and I quote, for we understand it, that is, they understood Aramaic. Viewers, Aramaic is indeed the third language of the Holy Scriptures, along with Hebrew and Greek. The portions of Scripture where Aramaic can be found are Ezra 4 verse 8, right through to Ezra 6 verse 18, Ezra 7 verse 12 to 26, which is a total of 67 verses, and Daniel 2 verse 4b to Daniel 7 verse 28, a total of 200 verses, as well as in Jeremiah 10 verse 11. Friends, when the Babylonians conquered Assyria, it made sense for them to use the language that was common to both empires. And this is precisely why the Chaldeans spoke to Nebuchadnezzar in Aramaic in Daniel 2 verse 4, which we read earlier. This also explains why a portion of the book of Daniel was written in Aramaic. Similarly, my friends, when Babylon was eventually conquered by the Medo-Persian Empire, they too used Aramaic, even in official correspondence during the reigns of Darius, Cyrus, and Artaxerxes, who were kings of Medo-Persian Empire. This is also why sections of Ezra 4 verse 8 through to Ezra 6 verse 18, Ezra 7 verse 12 to 26 were written in Aramaic as well. And I read that letter that they wrote to Artaxerxes earlier. It is not in doubt that most Jews understood and could speak both Hebrew and Aramaic, because after all, they had spent 70 years in Babylonian captivity, and Aramaic was one of the languages of the empire. It is also a fact that many Jews chose to remain in Babylon, even during the reign of Persia, such as Mordecai. And this is how Esther became queen of Persia after Vashti was deposed. Hebrew was the Jews' native language that was spoken at home among them, as well as the language of the Holy Scriptures, while Aramaic was the language that was spoken in the wider society in the Persian Empire. Therefore, Aramaic was considered the lingua franca throughout the Persian Empire. That is a language that is adopted as a common language between speakers whose native languages are different. So because the Persian Empire was so vast, at one point it stretched all the way from India to Ethiopia, and you had various languages and dialects. But what was common in the empire was Aramaic, and that was the language that was spoken primarily in the empire at the time. But each nation had their own unique language or their native tongue. Throughout the centuries that followed after the Jewish exile in 586 BC, both Hebrew and Aramaic continued to be spoken even up to the time of Christ during the first century. Even today, Aramaic remains a language that is spoken in some remote villages of Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey, but has largely been replaced by Arabic when the Muslims conquered the Middle East. However, Hebrew remains to this day the official language of the state of Israel. Let's now look at the Greek language. The emergence of Greek as a universal language during the centuries leading up to the birth of Christ was attributed to the successes of Alexander the Great as a military strategist. He conquered the then known world in a relatively short amount of time, less than 13 years. And when he died at the age of 32 years old in 323 BC, Alexander the Great's empire was the largest of its time, covering approximately 2 million square miles. Under Alexander the Great, the Greeks made it a point of duty to Hellenize those they conquered. And central to this was the promotion of Greek cultural values, religion, and practice. Hellenization, my friends, was mainly done through the spreading of Greek as a language, and it was very successful in supplanting other tongues at that time. This was evident in that even after Rome's conquest of the Greek Empire, Greek retained its status as the universal language of trade throughout the Mediterranean region. Greek was so dominant that it even became an official language of the Roman Empire later on. In the 2nd century BC, the Hebrew scriptures were translated in what is commonly called the Septuagint, or the Greek Old Testament, and Greek was the language in which the New Testament was originally written. Let's now look at Hebrew. Hebrew, like Greek, are not only languages or tongues, but they also denote nationality. So to get an idea as to what language Jesus spoke primarily, let's trace his ancestry. The English word Hebrew occurs 26 times in 25 verses in the King James Version. But the Hebrew word translated as such is Ivri, Strong's H 5680. Hebrew is derived from the name Eber or Eber, Strong's H 5677. And Eber was the great grandson of Shem. And you can see this in Genesis 10, verse 21 to 22, in particular, verse 24. Ivri means one from beyond. And it occurs 34 times in 32 verses of the Hebrew Concordance of the King James Version. Let's now do a quick search on the word Hebrew and look at the Strong's number, Strong's H 5680, in the Blue Letter Bible, so we can see that Hebrew was not only a language, but it also denotes nationality. So we're going to look for the word Hebrew in the Blue Letter Bible, and we're going to search for the Strong's number. It's asking, do you mean to perform a search for Hebrew? Yes. So I'm going to click on that. And it says that Hebrew occurs 26 times in 25 verses, as I mentioned. But what I'm interested in is the Strong's number, H5680. And this is the pronunciation of Ivri.
Strong's H 5680. Ivri. Ivri.
Ivri. And notice what it says. It occurs 34 times. It is translated Hebrew 29 times, Hebrew woman 2 times, Hebrew 1 time, Hebrewess 1 time, Hebrew man 1 time. Outline of biblical usage. Hebrew, it means one from beyond. And it is a designation of the patriarchs and the Israelites. Strong's definition, an Eberite, that is Hebrew, or descendant of Eber, Hebrewess or Hebrew woman. What I want to do now is to look at the verses in which Hebrew appears. Notice some of these verses. Genesis 14, verse 13. And there came one that had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew. So Abram was clearly an Hebrew. Abram was an Hebrew. Genesis 39, 14. This is speaking about Joseph and the encounter between him and Potiphar's wife. That she called unto the men of her house and spake unto them, saying, see, he hath brought in an Hebrew. So Joseph was considered an Hebrew unto us to mock us. He came in unto me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. She had told a lie on Joseph. She was the one that pestered him daily to lie with her. And Joseph fled, leaving his garment in her hand. Verse 17 of Genesis 39 says, and she spake unto him according to these words, saying, the Hebrew servant which thou hast brought unto us came in unto me to mock me. So she was telling that to her husband Potiphar. And then this is Joseph telling you that he was a Hebrew. Genesis 40, verse 15. For indeed I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also have I done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon. Genesis 41, verse 12 confirms that Joseph was indeed a Hebrew. These are the men that he had interpreted the dreams for. And there was there with us a young man, an Hebrew servant to the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted to us our dreams. To each man according to his dream, he did interpret. And then let's go down further and look at Exodus 2, verse 6 and 7, which tells us that Moses was also a Hebrew. And when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept, and she had compassion on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Verse 7 says, then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call to thee a nurse of the Hebrew woman, that she may nurse the child for thee? So Moses was clearly a Hebrew. Exodus 2, verse 11. And it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, that he went out unto his brethren, people, his countrymen, and looked on their burdens, and he spied an Egyptian smiting an Hebrew, because the children of Israel were in bondage in Egypt. So clearly the children of Israel were Hebrew. One of his brethren, there it is, one of his countrymen. And let's scroll further. Exodus 5, verse 3. And they said, the God of the Hebrews had met with us. Let us go, we pray thee, 3 days' journey into the desert, and sacrifice unto Jehovah our God, lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword. So it is clear, and you can read the rest of the verses, that Hebrew was not only a language, but it also denotes a nationality. Let's go back to the notes. So a careful examination of all those Old Testament verses reveal that Hebrew is a designation given to the patriarchs and the Israelites. Abraham, the progenitor of the Israelite nation, was an Hebrew. So all his descendants would naturally be Hebrews as well. Abraham begot Isaac, Isaac begot Jacob, and Jacob's name was then subsequently changed to Israel by God. Jacob had 12 sons, who were then known as the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph, the 11th son of Jacob, was therefore an Hebrew, and we show the verses, as can be seen in those verses on the screen. Moses, who led the children of Israel out of Egyptian bondage, was also an Hebrew. We looked at those verses. Jehovah, the only true God, was referred to as the God of the Hebrews, that is, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or the God of Israel. And you can look at those verses to prove the point. Jonah, the son of Amittai, declared, I am an Hebrew, Jonah 1, verse 9, to the mariners when there arose a mighty tempest in the sea. So Jonah was also a Hebrew because Jonah was an Israelite. Therefore, it is absolutely clear and not in any doubt that all Israelites were Hebrews by nationality. This is precisely why Matthew links Jesus as a descendant of both David and Abraham. Matthew 1, verse 1 says this, the book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So Jesus was a descendant of David and ultimately a descendant of Abraham. So it clearly means that Jesus was a Hebrew. Jesus' genealogy can also be seen in Luke 3:23, 31, 34 to 36, which means that Jesus was not only Jewish, but also Hebrew and had an Hebrew name. This is Jesus' Hebrew name, and it is Yehoshua. It can be found in Deuteronomy 3, verse 21. This is actually talking about Joshua, but it's the same name. Joshua and Jesus had the same Hebrew name. And this is the Hebrew. It is pronounced Yehoshua, or there's a shortened form, Yeshua. And that shortened form can be seen in Nehemiah 8, verse 17. Jesus' given Hebrew name was Yehoshua, Strong's H3091, or the shortened form Yeshua, which means Jehovah is salvation. Yehoshua is translated in English as Joshua, but was transliterated in Greek as Jesus, which is the Strong's G2424. And that's how we got the name Jesus in our modern versions of the Bible. This is how Yeshua became Jesus, as it was transliterated from Hebrew to Greek and then from Latin to English. Transliteration, my friends, is the conversion of letters and sounds from one language into another, such as from Hebrew to Greek. In converting the Hebrew word Yeshua into Greek, they encountered a couple of problems because there's no Y sound nor sh sound in the Greek alphabet. Therefore, to compensate for the shortcoming, the Greek translators used the following letters, iota and eta, to get the Y sound, and sigma for the SH sound. In Greek, the family name of males usually end with an S because the language is gender specific. Hence, we have Jesus. See the image below for the transliteration of the Hebrew Yeshua to the Greek Jesus and then the Latin Jesus. So this is the Hebrew name. This is the Yod, Shin, Vav, and this is the Ayin with a pata. So you get the Hebrew word Yeshua. And then it was transliterated in the Greek as Jesus. This is the iota, the eta, the sigma, omicron, upsilon, and the sigma, which is the final S that denotes that it is talking about a male person. And then Yeshua was transliterated in the Latin, and you get Jesus in the Latin. It wasn't until the 16th century that the letter J was added to the alphabet, courtesy of an Italian grammarian by the name of Gian Giorgio Trissino, who made a clear distinction between the letters I and J. Prior to that, both I and J were used interchangeably and eventually found themselves side by side in the English alphabet. However, the 1611 version of the King James Version did not use the letter J because it was translated from the Vulgate, which is the Latin translation of the Bible, and therefore used Jesus for the Messiah's name. The letter J first appeared in our English Bibles after the publication of the 1638 version of the King James Bible, when the Latin Jesus was anglicized, that is, to make English inform our character, it was anglicized to Jesus. Essentially, that's how the name Jesus came into existence, and that's why Yeshua is commonly called Jesus by English-speaking Christians. Let's now look at all the New Testament verses that mention the word Hebrew to identify the primary language that was spoken by Jesus. So in the Old Testament, Hebrew predominantly refers to the nationality of those persons from the nation of Israel. But in the New Testament, Hebrew is primarily used to refer to the language that was spoken by the Jews, including Jesus. The word Hebrew occurs 11 times and always refers to the language spoken by the Hebrews, with the exception of Philippians 3, verse 5. The word Hebrew or Hebrews occurs 3 times and only refers to nationality, an Israelite or the seed of Abraham. And you can see Acts 6, verse 1, 2 Corinthians 11, verse 22, and Philippians 3, verse 4 to 5. Let's consult the original Greek in the Blue Letter Bible to see the word translated as Hebrew. And in the New Testament, there are 4 different Greek words used to refer to Hebrew. Strong's G 1444, Strong's G 1445, Strong's G 1446, and Strong's G 1447. It refers to Hebrew, the Hebrew tongue, and there's also Strong's G 1258. Let's now go to the Blue Letter Bible to look at the word, the Greek word translated as Hebrew. So we're going to type in Hebrew, and we are going to go to the New Testament. We're going to go to the New Testament. So here it is. The first place it is mentioned is in Luke 23, verse 38. And this is what was written. And this is speaking about what was written above the head of Jesus on the cross. And a superscription also was written over him in the letters of Greek and Latin and Hebrew. This is the King of the Jews. So it was written in Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. Let's look at the word for Latin, because this was one of the languages. So what was written above the head of Jesus shows that these 3 languages were the main languages at the time in the Roman Empire: Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. We looked at Greek before. This is Latin. Who spoke Latin? This is the pronunciation.
Strong's G 4513. Chromaikos. Chromaikos.
Chromaikos occurs only one time, and it is in that verse. Latin, of Rome's strength. That's the meaning. The language spoken by the Romans. Romaic, that is Latin. Latin. So Latin was the language spoken by the Romans. Let's now go back to that verse and look at the word, Greek word translated as Hebrew, which is Strong's G 1444. 1444. This is it. Hebraikos. This is the pronunciation.
Strong's G 1444. Hebraikos. Hebraikos.
Hebraikos. And it occurs one time, and it means Hebrew, the Hebrew language. So it was written in Hebrew. Strong's definition: Hebraic, or the Jewish language, Hebrew. Very plain. The next verse in which Hebrew appears is John 5, verse 2. Now there is at Jerusalem by the sheep market a pool which is called in the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches. Different number, Strong's G 1447. So this was called Bethesda in the Hebrew tongue. This is the Greek word translated as Hebrew tongue, Hebraisti. This is the pronunciation.
Strong's G 1447. Hebraisti. Hebraisti.
Hebraisti. It occurs 6 times. And it means it is translated in the Hebrew tongue 3 times, in the Hebrew 2 times, in Hebrew 1 time. Outline of biblical usage in Hebrew, that is in Chaldea. This is a wrong designation. It simply means in Hebrew. Chaldea is another language spoken by the Chaldeans, which we looked at earlier in the Old Testament, which is Aramaic. And Aramaic and Hebrew are 2 separate languages. Strong's definition: Hebraistically, or in the Jewish language, in the Hebrew tongue. So let's go back to the other verses. We're looking at all the verses in which the Hebrew language appears. John 19, verse 13. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus forth and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the Pavement, but in the Hebrew, Gabbatha. Same number, Strong's G 1447. We looked at it earlier. It also appears in John 19, verse 17. And he, bearing his cross, went forth into a place called the place of a skull, which is called in the Hebrew, Golgotha. All right, same number, Strong's G 1447, Hebraisti. Hebrew is also mentioned in John 19, verse 20, which is a similar reading of what was done earlier in Luke. This title then read many of the Jews. So the Jews clearly could read what was written. Why? Because it was written in their native tongue. For the place where Jesus was crucified was nigh to the city, and it was written in Hebrew, and that is why they could read it, because it was their native tongue. It was written in Hebrew and Greek and Latin. The next place in which the Hebrew language appears is in Acts 21, verse 40. And this is very important. So let's look at that. But I'm going to go and read the passage so you get the context of what was happening. This is very, very important to identify what language Jesus spoke. Hebrew was a language that was spoken by the Jews, not Aramaic. Acts 21, verse 27 onwards. And when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews, notice the Jews which were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people and laid hands on him, and crying out, Men of Israel, help, this is the man. So they were talking to their countrymen. Men of Israel, help, this is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people and the law and this place, and further brought Greeks also into the temple, and had polluted this holy place. For they had seen before with him in the city Trophimus and Ephesians, whom they supposed, they didn't know, they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. Verse 30 says, and all the city was moved, and the people ran together, and they took Paul and drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut. And as they went about to kill him, tidings came unto the chief captain of the band that all Jerusalem was in an uproar, who immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down with them. And when they saw the chief captain and the soldiers, they left beating of Paul. So they were beating Paul. Then the chief captain came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains, and demanded who he was and what he had done. And some cried one thing, some another among the multitude. And when he could not know the certainty for the tumult, he commanded him to be carried into the castle. And when he came upon the stairs, so it was that he was borne of the soldiers for the violence of the people. For the multitude of the people followed after, crying, away with him. So they wanted to kill Paul. And as Paul was to be led into the castle, he said unto the chief captain, may I speak unto thee? Who said, canst thou speak Greek? So here we know from this verse that Paul could speak Greek. And Paul, by his own admission, said that he could speak more languages than most. The verse goes on to say, so Paul was speaking to the captain in Greek. So much so that he said, canst thou speak Greek? Art thou not that Egyptian? So even the captain thought that Paul was an Egyptian. Art not thou that Egyptian, which before these days made us an uproar, and led us out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers? But Paul said, I am a man which am a Jew. Paul said that he was a Jew of Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city. And I beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people. I want to click on this word, this number for Jew. Paul said he was a Jew. It is Iudaios. This is the pronunciation.
Strong's G 2453, Iudaios. Iudaios.
Meaning person who came from Judah. But in this case, Paul was saying that he was an Israelite. It occurs 196 times. It means Jew of Judea or Jewess. Notice the outline of biblical uses. Jewish, belonging to the Jewish nation. So Paul was an Israelite, so he belonged to the Jewish nation. Jewish as respects to birth, origin, or religion. Strong's definition, Judean, that is belonging to Jehudia, Jewess of Judea. So let's go back to the passage. So Paul said to the captain, I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city. So Paul, even though he was a Jew by nationality, but he was born in Tarsus. He said, I beseech you, suffer me to speak unto the people. Notice now, the persons who were trying to kill Paul were Jews. Acts 21 verse 40, where the Hebrew language is mentioned. And when he had given him license, Paul stood on the stairs and beckoned with the hand unto the people. And when there was made a great silence, he spake unto them in the Hebrew tongue, saying, so Paul spoke Hebrew Paul spoke to them in the Hebrew tongue. Notice what transpired in the next chapter. Paul's defense before the Jews. Acts 22, verse 1. Men and brethren. So he was speaking to his countrymen. Brethren means persons of the same nation. Men, brethren, and fathers, hear ye my defense, which I make now unto you. And then notice what Acts 22, verse 2 says. And when they heard that he spake in Hebrew, in the Hebrew tongue to them, they kept the more silence. And Paul went on and he said, and then he said, I am verily a man which am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, yet brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, and taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers, and was zealous toward God, as ye all are this day. So Paul said that he was a Jew, and he addressed the people in the Hebrew tongue. And notice what happened. This is in parentheses, the brackets, and when they are, so this is an explanation. Luke is giving an explanation here. And when they heard that he spake in the Hebrew tongue to them, they kept the more silence, and Paul went on to give his defense. So it is clear that Hebrew was a language that was spoken by the Jews. Let's go back to looking at other verses in which the Hebrew language appears. So we looked at Acts 21, verse 40, and Acts 22, verse 2. But this verse, Acts 26, verse 14, is the clearest verse in all scripture that Jesus, Yeshua, spoke Hebrew. I'm going to look at the context, so you get the context. Paul was here making his case to King Agrippa, and he was recounting his conversion experience and what transpired while he was on his way to Damascus. Notice what happened. Paul is speaking, whereupon as I went to Damascus with the authority and commission from the chief priests, at midday, O king, I saw in the way a light from heaven above the brightness of the sun, shining round about me and them which journeyed with me. And notice what Paul said. We are looking at what language did Jesus speak. Notice what Paul said. And when we were all fallen to the earth, I heard a voice speaking unto me and saying in the Hebrew tongue, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. Who was speaking to Paul? Verse 15 says, and I said, who art thou, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus whom thou persecutest. In Hebrew, he would have said, he spoke in the Hebrew tongue, he would have said, I am Yeshua whom thou persecutest. And then Jesus went on to tell him a few things. So this verse, Acts 26, verse 14, tells us without a shadow of a doubt that Jesus spoke in the Hebrew tongue. Jesus spoke Hebrew because Jesus was Hebrew, and that was his native language. Let's go back to the other verses in which the Hebrew language appears. So we looked at, and we are coming down. So there are 3 more verses in the entire New Testament. Philippians 3, verse 5. This is one of the exceptions where Hebrew does not refer to the language, but actually a nationality. Paul was again making his case. He said that he was circumcised the 8th day because he was an Israelite, and that was the token of the covenant that God had with Abraham. Every male child had to be circumcised on the 8th day. So Paul was saying that I was circumcised the 8th day of the stock of Israel because he was an Israelite, of the tribe of Benjamin, and Hebrew of the Hebrews, as touching the law, a Pharisee. So Paul was saying that he was a Hebrew, he was from the stock of Israel, he came from the tribe of Benjamin, and he said that he was also a Pharisee. The final 2 verses in which the Hebrew language is mentioned is in Revelation 9, verse 1, and Revelation 16, verse 16. And this is what it says. And they had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, but in the Greek tongue hath his name Apollyon. Revelation 16, verse 16. And he gathered them together into a place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon. So even in Revelation, the last book of the Bible, Hebrew was still being spoken, and Hebrew was referenced in John the Revelator's writing, that this angel was called Abaddon in the Hebrew tongue, and that the wicked are going to gather to a place called Armageddon, and that is called thus because it was in the Hebrew tongue. So let's go back to the notes. So it is absolutely clear from the scriptures that Yeshua spoke Hebrew. Acts 26 verse 14 tells us that plainly. So let's continue to dissect and ascertain. We just decipher that Christ spoke Hebrew. So after looking at all these verses, it is absolutely clear that the Hebrew language was still being spoken in the time of Jesus and beyond by the Israelites, Jews, and Hebrews. Yeshua was Hebrew, and his primary language of communication was Hebrew, even though he also knew and spoke the Aramaic dialect. Here's a list of Greek words translated as Hebrew, which refers to the language that was spoken in the time of Christ in Israel. And we looked at these words. Hebraicos is Hebraic, or the Jewish language Hebrew. Hebraios is Hebrew, or anyone of the Jewish or Israelitish nation who use the language of the country. Hebrais is plain Hebrew, or the Hebrew language or dialect. This was the language that Yeshua spoke to Saul in Acts 26 verse 14 while he was on the road to Damascus. And finally, Hebraisti means to speak in the Hebrew tongue. There are 4 separate Greek words used to describe the Hebrew language in the New Testament. There is absolutely no Greek word for the Aramaic language in the New Testament. Here are a few other points to make the case that Jesus spoke Hebrew primarily. The scriptures record that Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel of the kingdom. And you can see that in Matthew 9, verse 35, Matthew 13, verse 54 to 55, and Mark 1, verse 39. The logical question then becomes, my friend, whose synagogue and what is a synagogue? The answer is patently obvious, that their synagogues is referring to the Jews or Israelites, because a synagogue, which is Strong's G 4864, is an assembly of Jews formally gathered together to offer prayers and listen to the reading and exposition of the Holy Scriptures. And if you want further proof, look at what Jesus said in John 18, verse 20. I'm giving you all the proof. John 18, verse 20. John 18, verse 20. This is what Jesus said. Jesus answered him, I spake openly to the world. I ever taught in the synagogue and in the temple, whither the Jews always resort, and in secret have I said nothing. Jesus said he taught and spake openly to the world. I ever taught in the synagogue and in the temple, whither the Jews always resort. So the Jews always resorted to the synagogue. Let's look at the Greek word for synagogue. This is the pronunciation.
Strong's G 4864. Synagogue. Synagogue.
Okay. And it occurs 57 times. It is translated synagogue 55 times, congregation 1 time, assembly 1 time. Outline of biblical usage. A synagogue, an assembly of Jews formally gathered together to offer prayers and listen to the reading and exposition of the scriptures. Assemblies of that sort were held every Sabbath and feast day. So it is clear that Jesus, when he taught in the synagogue, was speaking to Jews, and Jesus could only teach them in a language that they understood, and he taught them in Hebrew. If the Jews met to offer prayers and listen to the reading and exposition of the Holy Scriptures, which language do you suppose was being spoken? The answer is absolutely clear, that it was Hebrew, since the scriptures were also written in Hebrew. Further proof that Jesus taught, read, and spoke primarily in Hebrew can also be found in Luke 4, reading from verse 15 onwards. And he, that is Jesus, taught in their synagogues, there it is again, being glorified of all. He taught the Jews in their own native language, Hebrew by communicating in a language that they all understood. Verse 16 says, and he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day, that is every week, and stood up for to read. And there was delivered unto him the book of the prophet Isaiah. And when he had opened the book, he found the place where it was written. The scriptures were written predominantly in Hebrew and a small portion in Aramaic, as I established earlier. But the book of Isaiah was written only in Hebrew. Therefore, Yeshua not only could read Hebrew, but he could speak Hebrew as well. And this is what he said. The Spirit of Jehovah is upon me, because he had anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He had sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of Jehovah. Yeshua read it directly from the Hebrew scriptures, found in Isaiah 61, verse 1 to 2. And he closed the book, and he gave it to the minister and sat down. And the eyes of all them that were in the synagogue were fastened on him. And he began to say unto them, this day is this scripture fulfilled in your ears. Yeshua read the scriptures in Hebrew, and you can be assured that he spoke verse 21 in Hebrew as well. Verse 22 says, and all bear him witness, and wondered at the gracious words which proceeded out of his mouth. And they said, is not this Joseph's son? The scriptures, my friends, is absolutely clear that Jesus primarily spoke Hebrew because he was Hebrew, and that was his native tongue. However, the scriptures also record instances where Yeshua occasionally spoke using Aramaic words and phrases. The evidence for this can be found in the following gospel accounts seen below. I've done a chart that shows the gospel accounts, the Aramaic words and phrases that Jesus used, the Greek, and the meaning of those words. In Matthew 5, verse 22, Jesus used raka, which is of Aramaic origin, but it was spoken in Hebrew, and it means senseless, empty-headed, or fool. Mark 5:41, Jesus, when he was resurrecting Jairus' daughter, he said, Talita kumi, which is an Aramaic expression, which means, damsel, I say unto thee, arise. In Mark 7:34, Jesus, when he healed the blind man, said, ephata, which is another Aramaic word, which means to be open. It is of Aramaic origin. Mark 14, verse 36, Jesus, when he was praying, says, Abba, which means father. That is of Aramaic origin. Mark 15, verse 34, and Matthew 27, verse 46, when he was on the cross, he uttered these Aramaic words, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Let's look at Mark 7, verse 34. I'm going to look at all the other verses. The same thing will be seen, that these words are Hebrew words, but they are of Aramaic origin. Mark 7, verse 34. I want to show you something. Mark 7, verse 34. Mark 7, verse 34. And looking up to heaven, he sighed and said unto him, Ephata, that is, be open. Let's look at this word in the Greek. It is pronounced this way.
Strong's G 2188. Ephatha.
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 Okay. And notice the part of speech, the root or etymology. It is of Aramaic origin. It is a Hebrew word, but it is of Aramaic origin. So Jesus used Aramaic words of Aramaic expression in his daily conversation, but he spoke Hebrew primarily. The words or phrases spoken by Yeshua are all of Aramaic origin, but are also loan words used in the Hebrew language. Loan words, my friends, are terms adopted from a source language and used in the speaker's native language. It has already been established that Aramaic is very similar to Hebrew because they originate from the same linguistic family. That is, they are both Semitic languages. All languages borrow words and expressions from other languages, and this has become a standard practice when speaking in everyday life. Here are a few examples of terms and expressions acquired from other languages and cultures that are commonplace in the English language. See the chart below that I've drafted as well for some common words that are borrowed from other languages in English. So you have the language of origin, word, phrases, and the meaning. So Kung Fu is of Chinese origin, and it means a popular style of martial arts. Rendezvous is of French origin, and it means a place where people plan to meet. Waltz is of German origin, but it is used in the English vernacular, and it means a type of formal dance or even the music that is played at such dances. Paparazzi is an Italian word. It is of Italian origin, but it is used every day, especially in social circles. And it is a group of photographers who take pictures of celebrities. Tsunami is of Japanese origin. It is used every day in English. And we can remember some time ago in Indonesia, there was a huge tsunami that killed many people. A tsunami is a gigantic tidal wave caused by an earthquake. You have plaza, which is of Spanish origin. It is a public open area in a city. And you have words like glitch, which we use in computer terms, or klutz. It is of Yiddish origin, and it means, glitch means a small problem, and a klutz is a clumsy person. The gospel also records Yeshua using other words of Aramaic origin throughout his ministry, such as mammon in Luke 16:9, verse 11 and verse 13. He called Simon Cephas in John 1:42, as well as Bar Jonah in Matthew 16, verse 17. These words are all of Aramaic origin, but they were spoken in Hebrew. Jesus surnamed James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Boanerges, in Mark 3, verse 17. These are some of the only words recorded in the Gospels where it can be said that Jesus spoke using words of Aramaic origin, but the overwhelming majority of the words attributed to Jesus or Yeshua were spoken using the Hebrew language. The evidence, my friends, is conclusive that Hebrew was the primary language spoken by Jesus and the Jews in the first century, but words of Aramaic origin were also appropriated in their everyday use. We use pizza. We want to order a pizza. Pizza is of Italian origin. A perfect example of this can be seen in John 19, verse 13 and verse 17, where both Gabbatha and Golgotha are of Aramaic origin, but are used in the Hebrew language to refer to the pavement and the place of a skull, respectively. I want to show you to make the point that even though these words are of Aramaic origin, they were spoken in the Hebrew language. Notice John 19, verse 13. John 19, verse 13. John 19, verse 13 and verse 17. Notice this. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus forth and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the pavement, but in the Hebrew, Gabbatha. So notice Hebrew, Strong's G 1447, Hebraisti. We looked at that earlier. In the Hebrew tongue, in the Hebrew, that is in Hebrew. So it was spoken in Hebrew. But notice that Gabbatha is of Aramaic origin. This is the Greek, and notice the pronunciation.
Strong's G 1042, Gabbatha.
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 Root word or etymology of Aramaic origin, but it was spoken in the Hebrew language. This is because words can be appropriated from other languages and used in your native tongue. Nothing is wrong with that. We do it every day. So Jesus spoke primarily Hebrew, but there are some words, names of places that are of Aramaic origin in the time of Jesus. The same is true for words like Gethsemane, Matthew 26, verse 36. If you do the search, like I just did for Gabbatha, you will realize that Gethsemane is also of Aramaic origin. Rabboni, John 20, verse 16, is of Aramaic origin. And names like Bartholomew, Matthew 10, verse 3, Barabbas, Matthew 27, verse 20, and Tabitha, Acts 9, verse 36 and 40, these names are all of Aramaic origin. However, most scholars continue to insist and erroneously teach that Greek, Latin, and Aramaic were languages that were commonly spoken in Palestine at the time of Christ and not Hebrew. So-called biblical scholars have even gone as far as to suggest that when the scriptures mention Hebrew, that is Hebraicos, or Hebraisti, in the New Testament, it means Aramaic, since they claim that it was the language of the Hebrews. This is absolutely false and couldn't be further from the truth. There are even some new translations of the Bible that have rendered the Greek word for Hebrew as Aramaic to reflect the view of these so-called biblical scholars and experts. These modern versions and translations include the NIV, the ESV, the CSB, NET, and the NLT. The New International Version, the English Standard Version, Christian Standard Bible, New English Translation, and the New Living Translation. Some of these versions, my friends, are nothing but perversions of the truth, geared at trying to rewrite history and change the scriptural narrative to suit their own belief and teaching. Let's look at these versions and notice how they translate the following verses in their respective Bibles. I'm going to look at John 5, verse 2. Healing at Bethesda. So now there is at Jerusalem by the sheep market a pool which is called in the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches. So the original Greek says that the pool is called Bethesda, which is of Aramaic origin, but it is called thus in the Hebrew tongue. Notice how they translate the word Hebrew in these versions. I'm going to go to Bibles so we can see the translation. Translation for John 5, verse 2. And I'm going to search for Aramaic. So the King James Version has Hebrew tongue. New King James has Hebrew. NLT has Bethesda, and they have a footnote. Other manuscripts read Bethzatha, still others read Bethsaida. But notice the versions that translate Hebrew as Aramaic to suit their own narrative. The NIV, this is how it renders the verse. Now there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool which in Aramaic is called Bethesda. And they have a footnote as well, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. English Standard Version. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic. They have a footnote or Hebrew. It should be Hebrew because the word is Hebraisti, which has 5 roofed colonnades. Christian Standard Bible. By the sheep gate in Jerusalem, there's a pool called Bethesda in Aramaic, which has 5 colonnades. They also have a footnote. And then the final translation is the New English Translation. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool called Bethzatha in Aramaic, which has 5 covered walkways. All the other verses translated correctly to read Hebrew in the Hebrew tongue. So it is clear, my friends, that Hebrew was a language that was spoken in Jesus' time, but words of Aramaic origin were also spoken. So you can do the same thing for all these other verses and look at those particular translations, and you will see that they have changed the Greek word for Hebrew to read Aramaic. It was already established that even though Aramaic and Hebrew are similar, they are 2 separate and distinct languages, as can be seen in 2 Kings 18, verse 26. And we looked at that verse earlier. The New Testament was written in Greek, correct? And the Old Testament in mainly Hebrew. But notice how the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, shows the difference between the Syrian language, which is Aramaic, and the Jews' language, which is Hebrew. Notice how it is translated. The Greek word for the Syrian language is soristi. This is the Greek rendering of 2 Kings 18, verse 26. This is the Greek, soristi. It is pronounced soristi, while the Greek word for the Jews' language is Judaisti. which sounds like Judah, even in the Greek language, because Judea is the ancestral land of those who descended from the tribe of Judah, like David and Jesus. I'm going to go back to 2 Kings 18, verse 26 to show you the Septuagint, because remember, the New Testament was written in Greek, the Old Testament in Hebrew, but there's a Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint, which gives you Greek words for the Hebrew. Let's look at how they translate the word for the Syrian language and the word for the Hebrew language or the Jews language. Let's look at 2 Kings 18, verse 26 again, but we're going to look at from a different perspective. I'm going to look at it from the Septuagint. So I'm going to come here and I'm going to click on the Septuagint. And this is the Septuagint. This is the Greek. I'm going to scroll all the way down to the bottom to give you the Greek translation. All right, so this is the Septuagint. It was translated by 70 men, which give you the Roman numerals LXX, which is 70, Septuagint. This is the Syrian language. Notice in that box, it says SYRIST, because this is sigma, upsilon, rho, iota, sigma, tau, and iota. And it is pronounced Suristi, SYRISTI. And this is the Jews' language. Transliteration, Iudaisti, sounds like Judah, Iudaisti. And notice the verse again. So even in the Greek, the Septuagint, it makes a distinction between Aramaic and Hebrew. Notice the verse again. Then said Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, and Shebna and Joah unto Rabshakeh, speak, I pray thee, to thy servants in the Syrian language, for we understand it, and talk not with us in the Jews' language, in the ears of the people. So it is clear that even in the Greek Old Testament, there's a distinction between the Hebrew language and the Aramaic, and they are not interchangeable. They are two separate languages. So, friends, the scriptural evidence is overwhelming that Yeshua spoke in the Hebrew language, but he certainly knew and spoke Aramaic occasionally. Jesus may or could have spoken in 3 or 4 different languages, but that would be speculation on our part. And when it comes to the scriptures, I don't speculate. There's no scriptural evidence that definitively tells us that Jesus spoke Greek or Latin. No one knows for sure what language both Pilate and Jesus spoke in prior to his crucifixion in Mark 15, verse 1 to 5. For the scriptures is absolutely clear that Yeshua spoke to Paul in the Hebrew tongue on the road to Damascus, as was shown in Acts 26, verse 14. The absolute truth, my friends, is that the authors in the New Testament specifically mention that people were speaking in the Hebrew language. The New Testament writers also knew Aramaic, and they most certainly knew the difference between both Aramaic and Hebrew. Friends, viewers, the key to unlocking the scriptures is to take the scriptures as it reads, because it is absolutely clear that Jesus spoke Hebrew primarily. The common argument that is usually proffered is that Hebrew was a language of the religious elites, while Aramaic was a common everyday language. However, this presentation has shown that view to be incorrect and one based on a fallacy. Paul, by his own admission, spoke and knew more languages than most people, according to what he wrote in 1 Corinthians 14, verse 18. And in his defense against the Jews who wanted to kill him, because remember, they were beating him. In his defense against the Jewish accusation, he spoke to them in the Hebrew tongue, as recorded in Acts 21, verse 40, and Acts 22, verse 1 to 2. And this should have put this prevailing view that Aramaic was a common everyday language to rest. Furthermore, my friends, as I close, it must be noted that the reference to the Hebrew tongue found in Acts 22, verse 2, and you can check it in your own Bibles, in Paul's defense, is in parentheses. Parentheses are words or phrases inserted into a passage as an explanation and are usually marked off by round brackets, square brackets, or dashes. Authors generally use parenthetical remarks to clarify a point, such as in Acts 22, verse 2, when Luke, and here I am using parenthetical remark. I am telling you now that Luke is the author of Acts, just for clarity. So authors use parenthetical remarks to ensure that people get what they are saying, to clarify a point. So Luke left nothing to chance when he inserted that Paul spoke to the Jews in the Hebrew tongue. Therefore, without a shadow of a doubt, and by using the scriptures and the scriptures alone, it was clearly shown that even though Jesus spoke in Aramaic on a few occasions, Yeshua primarily spoke using the Hebrew language, which was his native tongue. I hope that this presentation was clear, and I hope that you were blessed. If you were so blessed, please share this video, and you can subscribe for future content. Thanks for listening, and thanks for taking the time to watch this video so that this argument or this view that Jesus spoke Aramaic can be put to bed. Jesus, once again, spoke Hebrew because Jesus was Hebrew, and that was his native tongue. Thanks again, and may God continue to bless us richly as we continue to study his words.